Okay. Good morning, Clever. So let's jump into it. So we try to use our time effectively on this. It's nice to see everyone. And today's topic for the next 10 to 15 minutes is what transpires when Jews fight an enemy. This week's Parsha, it was almost hard to cut it down to a few ideas that I think could be really relevant. But there's two or three things that really jumped out, which I think both provide perspective as well as tremendous Chizzuk and strength, which is really the goal of this initiative for the time that we spend together. So I remember about probably more years than I want to admit, at least over 10 years ago. I remember hosting Michael Oren when he was the ambassador for the States to Israel, and the Israeli ambassador to the States. And I remember his talk was, what are the 5 existential threats facing Israel at that time? And when we use the word existential, it's not like this, millennial existential crisis. It means like the existence of Israel. What are the 5 greatest threats? And I only remember 2 that he mentioned. I remembered number 5, and I remember number 1. And he did sort of like, if you remember David Letterman, he did the list starting from the bottom and worked his way up to number 1. So he opens with the 5th one is that Iran's going to have nuclear capabilities within our lifetime. And everyone in the room was kind of like, that's number 5? Like, I don't know if that's a comforting thought. And he went through, and I apologize. I forget what 4, 3, and 2, 1 was. But number 1 was, he said, the greatest existential threat that faces Israel, he said at that time, and I believe he meant in all times, is when there's lack of unity in Israel. He said there's no greater threat to the fundamental existence of Israel than that one aspect. And as I was reflecting on that, or rather, I reflected on that when I saw a pasuk in this week's Parsha, where Yaakov's about to engage against Esav. And the Torah says it in the following way. It says, Hatzileni na, please save me, miyad achi, miyad Esav, from the hands of my brother, from the hands of Esav, right? And the question's obviously asked whenever we study Torah, if it could say something shorter, it's like a telegram. If it had to spend less money on writing it, it would have. It doesn't add words for poetic, flowery type of expression. It means if the word's in there, it needs to be there. And all the commentaries say that you could have shortened the Parsha, gotten people out of shul a couple seconds earlier. If you would have said, save me from the hands of my brother, we know he only has one brother named Esav. And if it would have said, save me from Esav, we wouldn't have said, which Esav are you referring to? We realize that that Esav is obviously the brother of him. So why does it have to say from the hand of my brother and from the hand of Esav? So many explain that there's 2 threats that often face the Jewish people, right? There's the threat of internal, the threat of how do we operate as achim, as brothers and sisters? Do we view ourselves as brothers and sisters? And then there's obviously the threat of Esav, our noticeable enemy. What I sometimes compare it to is, by a fire alarm, you see the fire go off. You obviously need the alarm. You realize the fire is dangerous, but you know that enemy of fire. Everybody has, what are they called? What are those detectors? The carbon monoxide detectors, right? Which if you didn't have it there, you would think like there's no danger because there's nothing that you see that's that dangerous. You need something to say, hey, there's something going on that otherwise you wouldn't recognize. And in many ways, I think that same idea that Michael Oren said that day over 15 years ago of the existential threat, you have Iran, or let's just assume any enemy that we face. And we obviously realize that Hamas is funded by, those regimes. And then you have the internal struggle. I think the one aspect that everyone is becoming very clear with over this time is when the Jews come together, when they realize that it's not how do I sit there and protect myself from Achi, from my brothers and sisters, and the fighting against them, but rather we come together. That threat, once we have that in check, the other threat, the Iran's going to have nuclear capabilities as number 5, is one that as a people, we always can and will overcome. And the question then is, once we have that baseline, I think everyone's feeling it. I'm sure I'm not the only one that's getting these WhatsApps of friends of ours that are all going to Israel. I got another one from this morning, guy Rick Magder, he's down there with his wife, how he's going to a base and what he's doing out there and giving strength. And people are like, it means so much to have you here. And they're like, what do you mean? It means so much for what you're doing. And everybody's just in it together and in it to win it. There's a different feeling that we have as Klal Yisrael. That's great. But then there's the reality on the ground, which I think is part of what we all struggle with. Yes, we all celebrate the fact that the Jewish people have never been more connected, more united, more as one than in definitely my lifetime that I can remember, and definitely in contrast to October 6th and prior to October 6th in terms of that rift. But at the same time, what does that do for us now when we're in the middle of the crisis? And how do we sit there and navigate and gain strength through that? So, with the other 7 or 8 minutes that we have, I want to suggest two ideas. So, there's a very interesting pasuk that happens in this week's parsha where it says, after Yaakov and Esav are fighting, or Yaakov and this angel are fighting. And for those of us who remember in front, I don't know if it's still there by the JCC when you used to come in, now it's got a red structure, but there used to be this metal structure. And that structure, which was hard to define what it was actually Yaakov fighting this angel. It was a winged man, and Yaakov was sitting there struggling against it. And there's a whole battle that takes place, which has many deep levels of what that battle is. Is he battling his Yetzer Hara? Is it a battle with God? Is it a battle with an angel? What that battle is, we know is a critical battle that's taking place, but he overcomes and wins the battle against this enemy. And a very strange pasuk happens right after that. As he sits there and beats this, let's call it a thug that's trying to destroy him, all of a sudden his enemy says, wait, I've got to go, the sun's coming up. Almost imagine you're in a dark alleyway and someone's beating you up, and all of a sudden the light starts to come up and you realize people are going to see and you have to run. So he won. The weak Yaakov was beating this strong Sar Shel Esav, this strong demon, or whatever that enemy is against his mortal existence and his spiritual existence, and he wins. And the guy says, quick, I got to go and run away. So you would say, that's great. That's the end of the story. Yaakov survives, the person runs away, and life goes on. But before he goes, he says, Vayomer Shacheni Kela Shachar. This enemy says, Yaakov, let me go, right? Because the sun's coming up, the cops might catch me. And Yaakov holds on to him, and he says, Vayomer Lo Shalchacha. No, I'm not letting you go. Ki'im Berachtani. Unless you give me a bracha. It's like really strange, right? Imagine you're getting beaten up by an enemy that's much stronger than you, and you somehow are able to overcome them, and they're about to run away. You should be running back home and saying, this is great. I was saved from the most difficult challenge of my life. But instead, before Yaakov does that, he holds on to this person and says, no, 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 no. I want you to give me a bracha. Give me a blessing. So what's that about? So I saw Rabbi Sachs explains beautifully that whenever a person's in a space of struggle, a fight, right? And a person has to sit there and overcome a challenge that's harder than they've ever faced. Before they finish that challenge, they have to say, okay, what is the blessing that I'm going to walk out of this experience from or with? Meaning nobody goes, I think there's a phrase that we use in English, you never let a good catastrophe go to waste, right? What it means deeply is that whenever we go through a struggle and a challenge, we've got to walk out of there greater blessed than we went before we walked in with it. And I think one of the challenges that we're going to face, and hopefully we face it soon, in the sense that this all goes away, the challenge will be all this, strength of a people, all this reconnection to our identity and our pride, the next generation that's feeling more connected and awakened, like a shock treatment to the heart, where they feel that being a part of our people has never been more important. Right? The Berachtani will be, how do we please God soon? Ensure that anything that we've been able to go ahead and become through this, again, we've said this the last time, this doesn't explain why does it happen, right? I don't know the answers. None of us know those answers. Anyone who sits there and says, well, it happens in order that we should do this, we don't know. We just know, like we said, I think last time or 2 times ago, not lama, why, but lama, for what purpose. And what Yaakov is teaching us is whenever we go through a struggle, we have to think about, okay, where are we going to walk out stronger as a result of this? But I think there's one other caveat that's really important. See, usually the Torah is full of mitzvos, lots of commandments, right? Once we start hitting Shemos, the second book of Exodus, there's like hundreds of commandments that go for us. For the entire Sefer Bereshit, the entire book of Genesis, there's only 3 commandments that are given, right? One is Pru Ravu, is having kids, perpetuating, right, next generation. Second one is Bris, ensuring that there's an eternal covenant. And the third one, which is in this week's Parsha, is a very strange one. The third one in this week's Parsha is what's called Gid Hanasha, right? It's a certain sinew, right? Certain cuts of meat we can't eat. And the pasuk, in its prophetic sense, says something unbelievably crazy. If you think about this, remember, this is a book that's written thousands of years ago. The stories that's passed down over 4,000 years ago, and it reads as follows: the pasuk, "V'hutzala Yurecho." After Yaakov has that battle with the bigger enemy, he's in the boxing ring with somebody who's hits on a class way above his weight, so he wins, but he's limping. Hutzala Yurecho. He got a Charlie horse, a really hard one, and he couldn't walk that well after. He won, but he was limping. And it says, al kain lo yachlu b'nei Yisrael es gid hanasha. Therefore, because of this limping Yaakov from this existential battle that defined our people, because of that, we as Jewish people do not eat gid hanasha. Asher al kach hayerech, which is on this thigh, ad hayom hazeh. Until this very day in 2023, there is a mitzvah perpetuated of not eating this gid hanasha, this sinew, because of that one little battle. And the question has to be asked, isn't that blowing something out of proportion? I mean, he won. Let's celebrate. What's this? Don't eat this. He's limping. Why is the gid hanasha so important? And that out of all the things that can be mentioned, there's a mitzvah and bereshis. I get having kids, hugely important. Right? I understand bris, covenant. I'm in this for the long run, God. I'm not giving up on you. You're not giving up on us. From the second the child's 8 days old, they're into that covenant. Gid hanasha seems a little lackluster in terms of its importance. So I want to share with you a beautiful explanation by, actually I should pull it out, it's probably easier to see it inside, by the Sefer HaChinuch. You got to hear these words. And I think these are the words that give us strength beyond belief. I'm happy to send it to anybody who wants to see it inside, but the language is so beautiful. The Sefer HaChinuch, just on a side, this book, it's a commentary on the Sefer HaChinuch, but the Sefer HaChinuch is said to have been written by a parent for their child to go through every single mitzvah, to understand what's the reason for it, what's the sort of the meaning behind it, what are some of the mechanics around that. And he always gives what he calls sharshe ha-mitzvahs, the root of the mitzvah. What's it trying to really, take root in us by this mitzvah? So he says as follows. Listen to this language, it's absolutely beautiful. He says, Kedei shetiyeh remez liYisrael. This is supposed to be a sign, a symbol to the Jewish people. This little seemingly insignificant mitzvah of don't eat a certain cut of meat, because it reminds us of the fact that Yaakov, when he fought his mortal enemy, whether it be a physical or spiritual or both, he was able to overcome, but he was limping, right? That which took place back then, which is prophetic for the future of what the Jewish people are going to be like. This should be a reminder. She'af al pi she'yisbalu tsaros rabos begolios biyad ha'amim umiyad b'nei Esav. Even though what's going to happen is we are going to sustain and weather tremendous pain in our exile from the hands of nations and from the hands of Esav. She'yu betuchim shelo ya'avdu. You have to remember, you're never going to be destroyed. Ela la'olam yamod zaram v'shmam. Forever, you will continue to have children, and your name and your people will be perpetuated. Meaning, if you go into something thinking that you're going to lose, right, chances are you're going to lose. If you remember that no matter what it is that you sustain, and this could have been said in 1944, it could have been said in 1491, it could have been said in the early Crusade period, it could have been said during temple destruction period. If you know that when that's happening, right, that you're going to win. And there's a famous Gemara, which this reminds me of as we're speaking about that, of where when the temple is destroyed, everyone's crying and Rabbi Akiva's laughing. And he says, I realize that there's a prophecy that it'll be destroyed, but we have a prophecy that's going to be rebuilt as well. And just like that is going to be, I believe in full belief that ultimately we will succeed. So this gid hanasha, this sinew mitzvah of not eating something, is a reminder that even though you will have enemies like Yaakov had enemies, and you will be in pain, and you will be limping, you will always overcome. V'yavolahem goel v'yigalem miyatzar. And eventually you'll be redeemed from this. U'bezichronam tamid inyan zeh, and just by remembering this, when you're in it and you realize, wait, this is the eternal promise of our people, through this mitzvah, which will remind you, yamdu be'emunasam u'b'zikasam la'olam. You will stand firm in your belief and your righteousness as a people forever. Ulevasof, and in the end, tielahem Yeshua, you will be victorious. Kemosha matzinu ba'av, Just like we saw with our forefathers, Shazar Kala Shemesh, the pasuk continues that Yaakov went and the sun rose and he was shalom. He was complete. And after that, he went on his way and continued to build the Jewish people as they were. So I think that part of, and there's obviously much more to say, we tried to keep it condensed, is number one is realizing that out of the dangers that we face, the toughest danger is always the internal, not the external, right? However, when facing the external enemy, we realize that when we go through that, we have to be very cognizant of, we've better pull out every possible thing that we can as a blessing through this horrible experience to realize that ultimately we have to walk out of this stronger. And even when we're in it, we're already there. We just have to maintain that as we finish and move forward. Please God, it should be soon. And to realize that even though we have those feelings of, yeah, but we're broken, we're limping as a people, right? Physically and emotionally and spiritually. Although spiritually it's kind of amazing. I think people have already gone to a space of feeling a stronger piece of connection. We have to realize even though there is that limp, right? We knew that from the first battle that Yaakov, when he turned into Yisrael, that was the moment that he became Yisrael. We became Bnei Yisrael, not Bnei Yaakov, the moment that he struggled and overcame, because that was going to be the eternal rhythm of the Jewish people. And whenever we feel like, wait, I'm not sure if we're going to get out of this, the Sefer HaChinuch says the mitzvah 4,000 years ago was to remind every single Jewish generation that even though you're walking out of there limping, know that you will ultimately be victorious, you will succeed, and one day you will be shalom. And ultimately, what does shalom mean? I just got from one of the members in my shul that went to Israel to volunteer in Shiva Hospital. She said over Shabbos they wanted to give her off. She sent me a picture from Yerushalayim, the city of peace, the city of whole, that ultimately all journeys will lead back to the fact that the Jewish people will be victorious. And when we keep that in mind during this time period and stay strong, please God, we should merit to be able to see that unfold. And I'll just leave with one quick other thought. When it says that he's battling with this Sar, right, and he gets his name, his bracha is you're no longer Yaakov, you're now Yisrael. It says, why Yisrael? It says because you battled with God and with man and you overcame. And I think that's an important piece to also acknowledge. Yaakov had to struggle spiritually as well. Why is this happening to me? Hashem, you gave me a promise, right? This was going to be a glorious future for our people. This doesn't seem like what you promised is a part of that. Yaakov had to struggle through that. And therefore, one of the opinions was it was a battle with God. Right? It's not wrong to sit there and ask the questions, but we realize we overcome those questions as well. It's not bad to ask, how could people be like this and struggle with that reality of the free choice that people make that turn them into animals, but realize we struggle with that and we'll overcome that as well. And just like we've overcome it since the day Yaakov turned into Yisrael, as Bnei Yisrael, please God, we should be able to overcome this speedily and go back to that shalem, to that completeness, that Yerushalayim as well.